Hey guys, Gassy TV here with another build guide. Today we're going to be going through my old Soul Rest Summoner build guide and basically making a pretty big change, a couple of big changes to the build and updating it to be more in line with the current state of the content. So I'm going to show you in the gameplay footage here the high budget version of this build, and it is currently having a lot of stuff not sorted yet, so it's doing a lot less DPS that it should be doing, whereas the actual endgame DPS will be looking at I think we said about 40 to 50 million Shaper DPS. However, I'll be talking about this after I've showed you some gameplay footage. So let's just start a map and I'll talk about the build. That's probably the best way to do it. The build can be played both as a Guardian as well as a Necromancer. I would say that Necromancer has a few other perks that the Guardian doesn't have, and vice versa. For example, the Guardian will be a little bit faster thanks to the usage of Onslaught that is provided. However, you don't really get any big perks of playing the Necromancer when it comes to speed, because you don't go with Flesh Offering with the Necromancer. You instead are going for Bone Offering. However, the perks of the Necromancer is obviously the fact that you get some extra free spell block that you don't get access to as the Guardian. However, you get about 50% spell block as a Guardian, so it's not that bad. The other perk with the Necromancer is actually the duration that you gain as a Necromancer Ascendancy for your minions, so you don't have to resummon them that often. The build is basically designed to automate the resummoning of your minions as often as possible to basically allow you not to cast the offering too often, which basically means that I'm just casting it every now and then to maintain the actual buff for the sake of damage output. Damage difference between the Guardian and Necromancer is very, very small. The Necromancer does a bit more damage, but is slightly slower because not getting Onslaught. Now, obviously, there's a few things you can do to fix that. However, the trees are pretty much identical. I do believe the Necromancer costs one skill point less as well to be used. And that's about it. So that's the gameplay footage, and the build is not really complete at this point in game for the sake of the high budget version. So I'm going to explain some of the mechanics for this. The clearing is pretty simple. You don't need linked Soul Rest, you just need 6 sockets. I'm linking that with GMP and control instructions, minion damage, faster projectiles, summon phantasm support to make sure that you can get an additional 11 at level 21, 10 at level 20 phantasm on top of the staff. That's how you get 21 phantasms rather than 10. And then Death Mark for single target. However, for single target DPS, I do change Hypothermia and slower projectiles instead from the faster proj and GMP. So they're both green, it's very easy to switch, and that's about it. The other gear pieces for the lower budget version, you don't go with double curses, you only go with one curse. So the Triad Grip that needs to be 4 green does not go with Elemental Weakness. However, they are just without any implicit corruptions whatsoever, which will drastically reduce the budget required and make this very, very friendly as a League starter build. The belt, we're obviously going to abuse the shit out of Darkness Enthroned, which will be also, there's a link in the description below to a video explaining why Darkness Enthroned is so insanely overpowered for minion builds. It's probably one of the cheapest, most effective belts you can get for the sake of a damage approach when it comes to minion builds. Incredibly strong. The boots for high budget, I am using Aspect of the Avian, which you can place anywhere. That's a cheap approach, you can get that very easily. But the high budget version uses a +1 to all raise Spectre Gem. This is to allow me to use 4 Spectres to more reliably have power charges as well as the frenzy charges, whereas a low budget build you would simply just ignore the idea of having plus raise Spectre Gem, which means you just need a pair of boots with movement speed, life and resistances, and you're done, which is very, very cheap to get and very effective. Also helps allowing you to have another suffix slot open for the sake of utilizing it for attributes such as strength or dexterity, most likely looking at dexterity lacking for the build, which is something you have to play around when it comes to the higher budgets. The rings are very straightforward in this case because it's high budget. I need dexterity on quite a few pieces, so I got that on the ring. Unset to make sure we don't get socket starvation. This is also something you don't have to think about too much when it comes to the lower budget version. So in here we have the second ring, which is just life and strength and resistances. The amulet for a higher budget version will be using an amulet that grants you discipline as well as reduced mana reservation. very easy to craft in general, and then the harvesting in the current league, in the Harvest League, you can craft the remaining stats very easily as well. And then allocate Charisma, which is 2 golden oils and 1 opalescent, I believe, which is rather expensive. Again, this is for the high budget build, whereas a low budget build don't have to get the discipline or the reduced mana restoration, so that's very easy to play with as well. The Devouring Diadem, if you don't get an enchant on your helmet, such as any reduction of the auras you're using or skitter bots, then you have to use a Conqueror's Efficiency Jewel. This will be in the PUB, of course, in the link in the description, because the best damage enchant of the helmet would be Carrion Golem buff effect. The Devouring Diadem is very cheap at the moment. It could be a bit expensive in the early stage of a league. However, you just simply remove one of the auras and simply play without Devouring Diadem. But this would be the big piece to enable the defensive aspect of this build set. Recommend striving to that even in a lower budget build approach. The chess piece is a Sackable's Nest to basically make sure that you have Avian's Might consistently and get you increased effect of the aspect of the Avian buff. But also for the high budget version, it is crucial that you get 10% reduced mana reservation to allow us to run all the auras. And the auras we're running is pretty simple, straightforward. We're using Discipline, we're using Skitterbots, Hatred, Haste Aura, which is the first aura I would remove for low budget, but again, everything is in the PUB and the build guide linked in the description. And we're also using Zealotry and the aspect of the Avian. And this would not be possible without the 10% from the chest, the 6% from a Catalyst Amulet, together with the Discipline skill for Socket Starvation and everything around that. When it comes to the flask usage, obviously we use a Rubish Concoction with Glancing Blows to make sure that we have ourselves covered in terms of block chances. Bottle Faith doesn't do that much for the build, but it does increase damage because of the Consecrated Ground created during the effect applies 10% increased damage taken to the enemies, which is a very big damage modifier even for the Soul Rest. Jewel-wise, like I mentioned, Conqueror's Efficiency if you don't have the helmet enchant. Other than that, it's just straightforward life, res, minion damage, jewels pretty much everywhere, and a Thread of Hope. The reason we're using Thread of Hope is because in the high budget build, we are a bit starved on both sockets as well as skill points to make use of everything. So in this case, you pick up the 3 life notes here. We're currently lacking a little bit of experience to pick up the last one, and then we get the extra block from Whirling Barrier. And that's basically all we get from those. And then we also save a point by skipping the aura effect to get the reservation nodes from the Thread of Hope large ring. This is not something you'll use in the low budget ring build. The jewelries are very, very easy. The large cluster jewels, you want to go for Call to Slaughter, Raise and Pillage, and Renewal. The important ones are Renewal and Call to Slaughter. The Raise and Pillage is just a bonus. This is not something you'll need to worry about or even think about or even consider. So in this case, I've just recently started speccing into my Raise and Pillage on both clusters because you want to use 2 of them. So in reality, you only want to have a large cluster jewel with 8 or 9 passives preferably, and get Renewal and Raise and Pillage, which shouldn't be too expensive to get, especially because you're not going for all 3 notables in the lower budget. You can get a higher point one, which is very cheap compared to the 8 or 9 passive ones, and just make sure you get Renewal and Call to Slaughter, which are very easy to just alteration craft, and then in the currently with the Harvest, it's even easier with the Harvest crafting. The medium cluster jewels is a bit specific. I'm going to start with the high budget version, which is basically having 2 self-control modifiers. Now, self-control, basically what they do is they reduce the reservation cost of your discipline. This is crucial to have 2 of these to make this work. And the other mod would be Vengeful Commander. This is very easy to craft. I would strongly recommend just buying a jewel with a 4 passive non-curse aura effect, and then just crafting it yourself. The item level needs to be preferably below 68, I believe it is, to make sure that they are as easy to craft as possible. And a self-controlled Vengeful Commander, I have 2 of those up here. And the small cluster jewel is basically just as few passives as possible. If you want to cut the budget down, then you increase the amount of passive to 3 and they become pretty cheap. And you want to go for Fettle if possible. But there are plenty of other life-providing notables from the small clusters that would be not as good, but still very good, that can be utilized for the low-budget build to reduce the cost of the cluster jewels when you start going into them. So I have 3 of these, because there's 2 more down here, and the other part of the automation of this, which I'll explain in a bit, is the Kitava's teaching that gives us the Disciple of Kitava. So every second you consume a nearby corpse to recover 5% life and mana, and also do take 10% more damage taken if you haven't consumed. But since we're always consuming corpses on a regular basis, through Disciple of Kitava, as well as Feast of Flesh every 5 seconds from the Devouring Diadem, we are able to consistently consume corpses to keep our minions up. So we only cast Flesh Offering to basically keep the buff up. The other 2 cluster jewels is a bit specific. The first one is basically a Vengeful Commander with Replenishing Presence for the high-bodied version to scale your damage up. And the last one is a very crucial one that has to be there for the sake of the low-bodied build as well. And that is Blessed Rebirth as well as Life from Death. Now, Life from Death gives your minions HP, and they regenerate 2% of the life per second if a minion has died recently. Now, if you have 21 Phantasms out, and you resummon or summon a new one, the oldest one will then be replaced, and that actually counts as the minion dying. So you're consistently killing your minions when you have 21 or max cap of your Phantasms. You just keep resummoning them, which means that you're also keeping up the regeneration for your minions. This is very big for keeping your Animate Guardian alive, especially for the higher budget version where you really don't want him to die. And then when a minion dies, they also recover 4% of life, which is very, very good in combination with that. The other one is Blessed Rebirth. One of the biggest issues with Soul Rest is that your minions have a tendency of dying before they actually get to do damage. So you want to have one Blessed Rebirth that gives them a little bit of HP, but when they've been summoned, the next 4 seconds from the point where they got summoned, they are unable to take any damage. This allows you to actually make sure that you have a damage output in case you find yourself in a situation where your minions are decreasing in quantity and you're not getting any damage out because they die immediately. This is your solution to that specific mechanic. So the Disciple of Kitava, together with the Devouring Diadem, allows me to basically just summon corpses. And as you can see here, the Feast of Flesh is, well, first the Disciple is already consuming once every second, and Disciple of Kitava is basically consuming a whole pack of them. Right there, I have 16, I've barely done anything. And as you're clearing, even if you're shattering enemies, you're consistently going to be getting a ton of corpses consumed, so you actually have that uptime at a consistent basis. The Animate Guardian gear is pretty straightforward. It's using Mask of Stitch Demon for regeneration approach, but however, that's not necessarily needed thanks to Life from Death and Blessed Rebirth, allowing you to consistently get the regen out from your Soul Rest to the Guardian. However, I did have a really juicy tier 18 map, I believe it was, and also a situation at tier 16 map that actually managed to kill him despite that when he was not wearing a Mask of the Stitch Demon, which is why I've opted to use it. The other option that you can go for when it comes to the helmet would be Crown of the Tyrant. This is a very expensive approach and requires you to spec Avatar Fire for Elemental Equilibrium. This is again only for the high budget version. They're about 3.5 Exaltus right now, thanks to Previ's Bama build, I believe. Speaking of Previ, I do want to give you a big shout out because me and Previ, we've been talking a lot about builds we've been making quite regularly the last few weeks. And this is a build that he designed a version for and I designed a version for, and then we've basically tried to come up with ways to optimize both, and this is basically where we landed in terms of efficiency. So we want a big shout out to Previ for being someone I can go through and talk to when it comes to the higher end versions of builds. We're also going to be having an SRS build coming out pretty soon as well. So again, thanks Previ for being a perfect individual to talk to when it comes to summoner stuff. It's a pleasure, man, so thanks so much. So that's basically the design of the higher budget version. I'm going to talk about the skill gems before I show you the POV and the calculations of this. So I showed you the links for the weapon. In my unset rings, I have Flesh Offering and a Carrying Golem, since I got +3 level Socket of Gems. The 4 green sockets in the Triad Grip, I'm using Dash with Second Wind. Make sure that you have a Desecrate and a Haste. However, make sure that you do not have Haste linked with the Second Wind, or the Haste would actually be increased in mana reservation cost, so they cannot be linked together, but they still want to be in the gloves. So we use Haste and Vol Haste, and that brings me to the calculation later that we're going to talk about. The jewelries in the Darkness and Throne can be anything you want or need, resistances or damage and HP of course, and just whatever you feel like. Keep in mind that you still get a 75% increased effect of the jewels, so it's very good to balance resistances for when it comes to the higher budget version. We're using a Stormbrand when you're not using well, actually you can use Stormbrand anyways, doesn't really matter. Use a Stormbrand or an Armageddon brand, and then you're using Awakened Curse and Hit with the Convocation and Projectile Weakness. This is for the higher budget version. For the lower budget, you just skip the implicit on the gloves and you use a normal Curse and Hit. However, Stormbrand is perfectly fine to use at all times. if you're going Crown of the Tyrant, you will be provided with cold damage to your spells, which you do not want to block with. So if you go Crown, you have to spec Avatar of Fire. The other jewelries in the helmet will be the auras, because of Devouring Diadem. And that would be Zealotry, Hatred, Summon Skitterbots with an Awakened Generosity. Obviously, for a lower body version, you wouldn't use Awakened Gems at all. The chest piece is, you don't really need a 6-link. You can play around with this as much as you want to. I put Feeding Frenzy for the sake of linking that to the Guardian. But since I have a 6-link, I also have my Wraith Spectres in here. And as you've noticed, my Spectres are the monkeys. I have 2 Frenzy Charge monkeys and 2 Power Charge monkeys. You can combine this with adding an Arena Master if you wanted to. I didn't like that because of a few other reasons where the amount of charges, I would rather have the charges build up faster because of us resummoning minions. That means that our oldest minions might not always get 3 charges before they are replaced, which brings me to the DPS calculation I'll be talking about later, because we're going to talk about inflated numbers. However, to get the Wraith Spectre to level 25 to allow 4 Spectres, you need to use it in power level 4 as well as +1 to raise all Spectre Gems boots. This is something that is easier to reach when you're playing a Necromancer because our natural strength gives you 2 levels of gems. It also gets your Guardian a bit tankier, your enemy Guardian tankier compared to the Guardian Ascendancy version that I am currently playing. So I would argue for the Necromancer version to be a little bit better, but you can play both versions. In my case, I'm doing it as a Guardian because I didn't want to make another Necromancer. The other links would be Blood Magic for the sake of actually making sure they cast their charges to your minions. And then we have Meat Shield. Now I'm linking Meat Shield and Feeding Frenzy together. This will basically rule out both AI changes, so they're behaving normally like as they would without these support gems, but they still get the beneficial numbers, such as Taunt and Hit, such as the less damage, doing less damage, and having more minion movement speed, for example. And they do more damage to minions around it, which doesn't really matter. So by combining Feeding Frenzy and Meat Shield, their AI is basically untouched. By doing it this way. Feeding Frenzy is obviously just there to give us the Feeding Frenzy buff to our other minions or yourself, which then applies a buff to all your minions for the sake of extra damage. So that's basically the gist of it. I'm going to move over to showing you guys the POB. Let's see if I can bring it up right here. So this is the high budget POB, and something I wanted to talk to you about is, this is not even correct build. Hold on. Here we go. Here's a build. This is the correct build. So we're going to start off with the Ascendancy nodes. Obviously, Radiant Crusade and Unwavering Crusade is important because you get Intimidate and Unearth. You also get the Onslaught and extra resistances from Radiant Crusade and Bastion of Hope for the sake of getting that block chance up quite significantly. That's 20% spell block. And as a Necromancer, you would go for Mistress, Bone Barrier, Unnatural Strength. That's basically the gist of that. So it's 2 points, 4, 6, 8. And that gives you some extra resistances through the Bone Barrier, gives the enemies, your minions a bit better survivability, Unnatural Strength to help out that Wraith Spectre, Missile Sacrifice for Bone Offering, but more of the Necromancer version in the PoB flow. The last note on the Guardian, however, I went with Harmony of Purpose because I would actually get some endurance charges to get me some extra physical damage mitigation, which you get from your brand consistently hitting enemies. However, you can change this to actually do both of these 2 small nodes, which will give you significantly more damage, because both of these will actually... Sorry, not that one. This one, sorry. I lost my brain there for a second. Yes, increase effect of non-cursed auras from skills, which increase damage. You can go for Radiant Faith to give you a little bit more energy shield if you want to. The other approach would be to go Time of Need, which reduces effective curses, but since everyone's running with a Warding Flask, don't really benefit from the curse effectiveness of this. However, it does every 5 seconds regenerate 30% of your life over 1 second. I didn't feel that that was something I would feel comfortable using, because, you know, if I lose HP, I'll hit that life flask anyways. So I went for Harmony of Purpose, but it's a matter of personal taste. If you feel like it, you could drop Bastion of Hope and go all the way to Unwavering Faith to get more physical damage mitigation and more damage, because this node here gives you increased effective auras as well. It's a matter of personal taste in that end. So over to the actual damage of this. Let's see, here it is. This is currently displayed with properly leveled Awakened Gems at level 5, non-corrupted. Currently in the gameplay footage, you can see in the footage behind me right now, the Awakener kill we did. This is done with rather low-level support gems, and because of the low-level support gems being a pretty big factor, I didn't feel that I wanted to talk about the DPS in a video made from the stream, so that's why we're doing it in this video instead. However, when you have the DPS to the point where you have the Awakened Gems up to level 5, you're in a position where each of your minion is doing 1,768,529.4 Shaper DPS or Seers DPS consistently per second. You have 21 of these, and this is where inflated DPS numbers comes up. So if you do the full calculation of how much your minions would be doing with this, we're talking about a DPS of 37 million Shaper DPS. First off, this is without Avian Aspect being actually active, because it is incorrectly calculated in PUB. You have to do this manually instead of the configuration. So by activating the flask in the PUB with this, you can see that the actual DPS that you'll be doing is 2,358,000. Now, with that DPS, you are actually doing 49.5 million Shaper DPS. This DPS will be active for a total amount of 4 seconds, and then it would change to the aspect of the Avian's flight. And when that happens, you're back down to the 30 million or whatever it was. And then the next 4 seconds, you're up on 49.5 million Shaper DPS. However, these numbers are inflated. Now, we're not talking about the PUB warrior inflation of someone having a Vol Haste active, because we're not calculating Vol Haste. That's your increase, that's your burst damage sequence when you pop your Vol Haste. We're not going to care about that. The reason these numbers are inflated is because I mentioned earlier, which is why I'm using 2 charge monkeys for frenzy and 2 for power charges. That is that many of your minions might not always have charges, or at least not full charges. So if you were to remove charges from your minions, the actual DPS without the aspect of the Avian, it's actually closer to 1,079,000. So with that calculation, the build is without charges on any of your Soul Rest minions, doing 22.6 million Shaper DPS. Now this is obviously inflated the other way around, where this is actually lower than the DPS you'll actually be doing. So to avoid showcasing inflated DPS numbers, the build is doing between 22 million Shaper DPS and up to 50 million Shaper DPS, depending on the situation, because there are, if you summon perfectly your minions and then initiate the fight without spawning corpses in a single target fight, you actually will get 3 charges to all your minions. However, the enemy has to be targetable before your monkey starts casting the buffs, which will be 2 charges each. So I would say that you can expect around 30 to 35 million Shaper DPS if you average out the aspect of the might versus not having aspect of the might. So about 35 million Shaper DPS is to be expected in a higher budget version of this build, which is honestly not very expensive to do. The most expensive pieces would obviously be the Bottle Faith and the Awakened Curse and Hit. And the Awakened Curse and Hit only allows you to have a level 12 elemental weakness, so it's not that big of a deal. However, if we then move back to the low budget version of the the Soul Rest build, the budget is very, very simple. Like I mentioned before, you don't have to go for Race and Pillage to cut down the cost of the jewels. The point of the build is 89 with proper passive amount of cluster jewels. However, if you were to cut the clusters to have more points, like medium can have 5 without that affecting the amount of points invested, and large cluster can have more points, this build can still be finished around 90 something, and you can skip the jewel where I had Thread of Hope, for example, to save 2 more points, skip a life node here and there, and potentially remove the extra dexterity, which would allow you to actually save those points by saving in the price of the actual cluster jewels you'll be buying. So you can buy a so-called bad cluster jewel and actually still utilize that extremely well for a low budget version of this build. The DPS on the low budget build is basically 816,591, and this is utilizing the charge specters as well. So in this case, we have a configuration set with only frenzy charges, so no power charges whatsoever, and the DPS is 816,000 times 21, so that's a DPS of 17 million Shaper DPS in a beginner-friendly, league starter-friendly at least, kind of build where you can play as a lower budget, and this is very easy to achieve. However, the 17 million is obviously a little bit inflated, and this is without calculating the approach of utilizing the aspect of the might, so it's actually going to be doing a little bit more. So I would say that you can expect the build to do around 12 million Shaper DPS in a low budget build, is if we take away a decked out Animate Guardian, your DPS goes down to about, let's see if I can find it, goes down to about 688,000. If you want to calculate it to be a bit more kind to you in terms of budget, let's say you're doing 600,000 Shaper DPS instead, depending on your gear, and you multiply that by 21, you'll land on 12.6 million Shaper DPS without having an Animate Guardian on the field, and without the aspect of the Avian being present. And this is your top DPS with 3 Frenzy charges. So if you add the approach of using an Animate Guardian, even a low budget one with Leer Cast, Dying Breath, Victorious Flight Southbound, shit chest piece like Ambush Charge, Crusader Chainmail, you'll land between 12 and 13 million Shaper DPS in a low budget version of this. So that's basically all I want to say when it comes to this build. I do want to mention again, repeat myself when it comes to inflated DPS numbers. PUBs I showcase on this in my build threads on this YouTube channel. I do my best to avoid inflated DPS numbers. For example, the DPS I showed you in the previous video where I bring a Redemption Sentry Spectre build up to 157 million Shaper DPS. That's without inflated numbers. You can push that up even higher in basically conditional situations where you pop a Vol skill if you want to further increase the damage approach even more. And there's some upgrades on that build that would push that build over to about 170, maybe almost touching 200 million Shaper DPS if you want to. But the problem with that amount of DPS is that you'll never need it. And that's basically the gist of that build. However, I've been having a lot of fun with the Solaris build. I'll probably play it more for the coming days just to get the gems up. So I want to see how it actually feels when the high budget version is fully completed. And I'll be updating the build guide thread within the next couple of hours, so from the posting of this video. So that will all be linked in the description below. That's about it. I'm currently running a poll on my Twitter. There's a link to that in the description below as well. Make sure you follow me on Twitter. And that poll is basically decided on if I'm going to make a Dark Pact build closing in on around 100 million Shaper DPS, which will also be a budget-friendly approach next to it, or if we're going to start with the SRS build, which me and Previ have been talking about a lot, and it seems like we're going to be able to reach around 50 million Shaper DPS on a high-budget SRS build. Obviously, all of these builds will include low-budget versions so that you don't feel gated behind your currency. So anyways, make sure you hit me up in the comments below what you guys feel about this, the entire build itself, and hit the like button. Otherwise, you won't get any more Exalted. We all know the truth. Hit the like button, and that guarantees your RNG to be increased at least 10 times. And subscribe for more content. Until next time, stay safe. Keep rocking.